is strong, give me a call, blue. You put on headphones?
Julia, I don't understand why you're so hostile. I didn't do anything to you.
What do you mean?
You literally just been talking at me.
What? What other dance moves used to be popular? Remember the whip? Or the shenanay? Oh, the little micro dab? Oh, the drop. Yeah, good stuff.
Shut the front door.
Shut the front door! What?
Look at how cute this little baby is.
Alright guys, welcome to our next lecture. We're moving out of gunpowder empires. So basically if you break down our time period into units, the unit of gunpowder empires is now over. We're going to be moving into a unit about the Americas. So of course, a big part of period 4 is the Europeans' arrival into the Americas. Before we get that though, we need to hit upon some of the most important American empires that existed before the arrival of the Europeans. So today we're going to be looking at the Aztec and the Inca. So the first half of this lecture is going to be Aztec, second half will be Inca. So let's start with the Aztec. The Aztec, 1300 to 1521. Origin and rise. So we're going to be located in what we call today Central America. This is also an area known as Mesoamerica. Cool. I should have some maps up. With that, we're going to get into the Aztecs themselves. So, origin and rise. The Aztecs were a small, basically considered city-state. And their rise coincided with a couple things. First, the Aztecs were able to make some alliances or friendships with some nearby cities. And second, their basically willingness to really try harsh military campaigns. So their rise coincided with, one, their domination of their alliances to get other people on their side, and second, also in their push to try to conquer as many people around them as possible. So basically, in about 100-year span, the Aztecs went from just a city to controlling almost the entirety of Central America, around the central Mexico area and down south. So, once the Aztecs have all this power, they've conquered all this land, how do they maintain power and how do they keep that? So today we want to look at specifically how they consolidate and legitimize power, a constant thing we're always looking at for empires, and second, thematically, some big things we should know about the Aztecs. So first, how they consolidate and legitimize power, their history. Once the Aztecs took over all this land, they started teaching their history in a different way. As we know, how we view our own history has a lot of power. Identity is a big deal when it comes to why you should listen to people, who they are, their backgrounds. So the Aztecs thought it would be more impressive and more helpful if they said they were related to the Toltecs. You might not remember the Toltecs, but the Toltecs are one of the first Native American empires that existed. So the Aztecs, who actually weren't related to the Toltecs, said, we are ancient ancestors of the Toltecs, and that's why we have a right to rule. So that was a big part of their history, saying they were related to the Toltecs. You guys want to know what Alyssa was just doing? She was doing this in the background. Very mature. Second, one of the most important reasons why the Aztecs maintained power was their faith. We're not going to go into a huge deep dive, but we will give some key facts. So the Aztecs were had a polytheistic faith, which means many, many gods. But the most important part of their faith was this idea of the sun god fighting the darkness. So the key part of their faith was that there is this sun god that was basically, or this god of light, that was basically always fighting away the darkness. For him to continue fighting, though, he needed human blood. And so a key part of the Aztec faith was human sacrifice. This faith both legitimized the Aztecs and gave them a reason to keep fighting. So we want to get both those things down. First, the legitimization part. Here is the ruler and the priests who are constantly protecting the people, the Aztec people, by constantly doing these sacrifices, where they would put people up on these big pyramids they had, cut out their still beating heart, and push them down this pyramid and spread out their blood as a way to offer their blood to the gods. So visually, this is a powerful image. People are going to follow these groups that are able to have these very lavish ceremonies where they're giving these blood sacrifices. And second, it provides legitimacy because the ruler is protecting his people by providing these sacrifices. Now, on the other end, It also gives the Aztecs a reason to continue fighting, to continue expanding, because they keep on needing more and more and more sacrifices. So there's a reason to constantly be at war. They need to provide these sacrifices to give to the gods to maintain their survival. This leads to another way they consolidate and legitimize their power. Their military. The Aztecs had a very powerful military. Something I want to make sure is very clear. The Aztec technology, while impressive in some areas, never went beyond basic iron technology. So they don't have gunpowder, they don't have guns. They use basically like swords, knives. I'll put up an image of the specific things they used. But they didn't have what we would consider complex technology like that. Now, their military was basically always fighting. They were a military-based empire. And constantly expanding. That's why their empire is one of the fastest growing we've seen, because they were always on the warpath, partly to get these slaves, and also they faced constant rebellions. The reason they faced constant rebellions is how the Aztecs ruled. Now, to expand that quickly, the Aztecs took a very interesting, well, not interesting, we've seen it before, but picked a certain path when it came to rulership. The Aztecs did not try to take the people they conquered and make them Aztec. So their big thing was not trying to assimilate people. They weren't trying to create an Aztec identity. Instead, the Aztecs' goal was that we want to make as much money as possible. So they created this tribute system. The whole goal was that if you were conquered by the Aztecs, you would basically continue to live your life as you would, but now every month you had to pay this large tribute, and what was usually human sacrifices, gold, leopard skins, and other valuable pieces of goods, or other valuable goods. And so this would cause a lot of rebellions because people were constantly rebelling against this blood tax and this tribute. This tribute was pretty heavy. And so these states and these people that the Aztecs would conquer would constantly be like, we don't want to pay this, we're going to rise up. But the Aztec army was powerful, was constantly putting on rebellions, and was constantly increasing the size of their empire to get more tribute. And of course, this tribute, which was going straight to their capital city of Tenochtitlan, was able to continue to found and provide for this large army and provide for their people. Last but not least, the hierarchy in the Aztec Empire. The Aztec Empire had a very strict hierarchy to the point where there's actually rules about what clothes you could wear. So the emperor wore clothes that no one else could wear. Those priests wore clothes that only they could wear. The nobility, those born to high class, could wear really special colors. The basic idea here is that it's to say like what part of the hierarchy you are and pigeonhole you into that spot so you know your place. Now, when it comes to thematic understanding, this is a little bit new idea I'm throwing in this lecture, but I want us to get some information about the Aztecs and start really understanding it in our themes. In case you forgot, our themes are economic, political, or who's running the government, societal, who has power in society, cultural, or how like faith, clothing, or the way that people identify themselves, environment, how an empire people are working with the environment, and lastly, technology. So we're going to kind of go through some information about the Aztecs and categorize it under theme. So first, a big thing that happened within the Aztecs empire, which could be considered both economic and societal, is the merchant class. Now, the merchants, which I'll put up the Aztec name for merchants up on the screen, Aztecs went through a very similar thing that Europeans are going to be going through soon, and that many gunpowder empires were experiencing. And that was the rise of a merchant power, the merchant class. So in our normal hierarchy, we have the ruler, the nobility or religious figures, merchants and artisans or craftsmen, and then peasants. What was happening in the Aztec Empire is that as it was growing in size, it vastly increased its trade. It also started to take part in long-distance trade, as in like trading with people very far north into North America, trading down to South America. There's legitimate long-distance trade routes that existed. And so the merchants in Aztec society both gained wealth, and that helped the wealth of Aztec economic, because it's trade and wealth gaining, but it also increased their societal place. So even though they were never considered nobility, their wealth, the merchant's wealth, often was larger than a noble's. Woo, that was hard. A merchant's wealth was often greater than a noble's, which means they had more power. They often owned a lot of land. And so throughout the Aztec Empire, the merchants gained status and gained power. Second, divine right. We talk about divine right when it comes to Europeans, but the same way, the reason the emperor of the Aztecs is in power is because gods are telling, the gods say so. The gods are like, this emperor is providing the blood sacrifices needed for us to continue to battle in the darkness. In this way, this is very legitimizing. This idea of divine right is both political, as it is a reason why the group is in power, the emperor is in power. It is also cultural, this idea of faith in how people identify with their faith. That is a cultural identifier. and it's something that's really important to the Aztec people. Second, urbanization. This is going through a lot of different ways. Societal is a big one, where people live and how that structures the hierarchy. Urbanization would also be considered political, who's in power, and economic, because more money is often produced in cities. But anyway, the Aztecs were a surprising urban civilization. Now, I don't want you to think the majority of Aztecs, I'm speaking fast. I do not want you to think the majority of Aztecs lived in cities. But what was unique for the Aztecs is that if you were to think of Native Americans, it is often easy to go, oh, people who lived in these tiny tribes didn't have much power. The Aztecs were a fairly urbanized society. Their city of Tenochtitlan had upwards of potentially 200,000 people who lived in that, which is a pretty significant population, one of the largest cities in the world at the time. And this capital city, Tenochtitlan, was on a swamp. They actually drained this swamp. It was like Venice today, with canals that people could use boats to get around, floating gardens. It was a very impressive city. In fact, when the Spanish showed up, they were impressed with how well built the city was, how many people lived there, and the markets that existed there as well. Last but not least, the environment. The Aztecs showed an example of how they used their environment. Now, they did change it, as I said, with the draining of the swamps to be able to put cities, but also meant the Aztecs did a really good job living within their environment. They lived in ways that allowed the environment to still survive and thrive, but they themselves still changed it so they could have a significant population that lived there as well. Cool. With that in mind, this is where I'm going to pause for you guys to catch up. Make sure you get these notes down and be ready to go for the second part of our lecture about the Inca. So, if you guys remember a couple of videos ago, I studied the blade. While you all studied your notes, I studied the blade, which is important for home defense and also in case you're ever requested by your lord to serve on the battlefield. I have some bad news though. While studying the blade, I think I showed how truly powerful I am because my blade is now broken. I think I'm going to go to the blacksmith and ask for a refund. But basically, my blade is done. And so are many bits that were going to come from that. The good news is that, as Alyssa can tell you, we don't have very many knives in our silverware. And now this is just a really big knife. Alright, just gotta...
Can't even see the bread.
Might need to sharpen this. Okay. Alright, Alyssa, is the dishwasher clean? Down by the beck, down by the bay, where the watermelons grow,
Back
to my home, I cannot go. Alright guys, on to our second empire, the Incan Empire, 1438 to 1533. Its origin and rise is actually pretty similar to the Aztecs. Unlike the Aztecs, the Incan Empire was huge, traveling all the way down the west coast of the South America, what we consider the Andes mountain range. Their origin, though, is similar to the Aztecs, in which it started out as a single city that basically started conquering those around them, and slowly, over time, growing in size. And when I say slowly, I actually mean quite quickly. The Incan Empire expanded quickly and conquered those around them fairly fast. Now, comparisons with the Aztec end. The Inca and the Aztec are going to rule in very different ways. So looking at our similar setup, first is the Inca's centralized government. The Inca had extremely centralized government. The government basically had power over all people in its empire. And which is usually true, but here's a key difference. The Incan emperor, who was considered directly related to the gods, basically by the rule of the empire, controlled every piece of property in the empire. Now, we know this isn't actually true, but technically he owned everything. All the land, everyone's possessions, everything. And he was an extremely wealthy leader. It was said that he was carried everywhere on a throne made of pure gold. And basically was always showing that he was the greatest person that anyone could ever see. Now, in reality, we kind of hit this idea of faith too, with him being directly connected to the gods. The Incas were a polytheistic people, and often used their gods as a reason why the Incan emperor is in charge, directly related. But as the Incan Empire grew in size, here's another direct comparison to the Aztecs. So the Aztecs were very hands off. You could consider them decentralized. They really only cared if the people they conquered were paying tribute. The Incans were very hands on with government. They had an extremely large bureaucracy, or many people who worked in the government, because as the empire expanded, they divided their empires into different states. Each state was headed by an Incan official who worked directly with the emperor. Within those states, every township had its own Incan leader, who had its own leader who were chosen by the Inca. So, at a local level, local leaders still stayed in charge as long as they pledged allegiance, of course, to the emperor. At a state level, you had a government that was run by Incan chosen officials, that all reported to the Incan leader. In fact, there are even government officials whose whole job was to travel from state to state to make sure that the government was running correctly, was paying its taxes, and was treating people well. So there are multiple ways that bureaucracy was in check to make sure the government was running well, make sure it was serving the needs of the emperor, it was making sure that the people locally were served well. Now, within this bureaucracy, we see this idea of the mita. Now, in Incan society, there was really no such thing as currency. There's also no writing, actually. They actually recorded everything on ropes that they tied together. I'll put the name of it up on the screen. But there's actually no currency in Incan society. Instead, every township was basically given what it was needed by the government. Now, to get what you're supposed to get from the government, every person had to serve what was called a mita. A mita was basically you had to do a monthly service to the government. This could be anything to farming on government land, to serving in the military, to working on infrastructure projects. Whatever the government needed you to do, you had to do this monthly service as a tax to the government. So instead of collecting wealth, you did work for them. This is a system that will be used by the Spanish later on as a way to get the natives to work for them. Last but not least, infrastructure. The Incans, since they were heavily set in these mountain ranges, have one of the most impressive road systems ever created. It was really important to the emperor that they could spread messages quickly and their armies could move fast as well. So wherever the Incans conquered, they created this huge, basically like a highway system to make it really quickly to travel. Many of those roads are still around today. But this road system, you could compare it basically to like the Roman road system with how much it connected the empire, allowed easier governance, and made sure the Incan emperor's presence could be felt wherever it needed to be. Now, within the thematic understanding, we're going to do another sort of thematic understanding as well. Faith is heavily tied to culture. Now, wherever the Incans conquered, they are both accommodating and assimilatory. So they do a little bit of both. They're assimilatory in that those who ruled locally, so if you ruled in an area and Incans took over, you got to keep your post, but you had to do a couple things. First, you had to learn the Incan language, which I'll put up on the screen because I'm terrible at pronunciations. You had to learn the Incan language. You had to pledge loyalty to the Incan emperor. You had to follow the Incan faith, and you had to send your children off to they had to send their children off to the capital of the Incan Empire, Cusco, a place where they would then get educated in Incan beliefs, culture, and things like that. So basically, as a leader or local nobility, you had to become Incan. You had to assimilate to Incan culture. The average Incan, though, the peasants on a local level, were basically allowed to live as they were. So they didn't have to change at all. They did have to, basically admit that the Incan gods were better than their gods, but they didn't have to actually convert. So you have to keep your faith, you got to keep everything basically the same. So just make sure we're clear. Accommodating assimilatory to the people they conquered. Those that were local rulers had to assimilate to Incan culture. Those who were just normal peasants were accommodated pretty well. And this is very cultural. Education, faith, anything that changes identity. Politically wise, as I talked about, the Incan emperor had all the power. Everyone was respondent to him. His bureaucracy also has a lot of power. They kept a really close watch on what happened. So while there is Incan nobility, the government really has power all the way down to almost a local level, as there are Incan chosen leaders everywhere. Often people who are trained in the Incan government and then sent out. So it's not local people, it's people that are coming from different areas to rule in the name of the Incan emperor. Last but not least, gender. This is something that actually the Incans and the Aztecs share. So I want to make sure it's very clear. Incans and Aztecs share this. They had a very interesting view on gender. So unlike in Europe, where you see a very gender split of men having power over women, same thing in China, men having power over women. In Islamic empires, those are a little bit more equal. In Aztecs and Incans, there's this basically considered dual role split. Men, in what was considered manly activities, had power. Women, what were considered women activities, had power. They lived in what was considered separate spheres. But in those spheres of living, they were considered the dominant group. Cool. With that in mind, make sure you get that your notes updated, ready to go. And that is our Native American empires, Incan and Aztec.